Hey everybody, welcome to Mind Matters, Navigating Head Injuries and Concussions, where we dive deep into important topics on personal injury law. I'm your host, Kiley, the firm's treatment coordinator, and today we have a special guest, attorney John Mobley, who is going to be discussing traumatic brain injuries in the context of car crashes and some of the long-term impacts on brain injury victims may experience. So last time we addressed a long list of delayed complications after brain injury in part 1 of the podcast. Hope you check that out. Now we're going to turn to some of the other longer-term complications. So welcome, John.
Thank you for having me, Kiley. It's a pleasure, as always, to be here. Wanted to spend some time today addressing, like you mentioned, the other half of some of these scary long-term complications that stem from people and our clients that are experiencing traumatic brain injuries.
Great place to start. So as always, you want to start with the foundation, right? So let's talk about that. What is a traumatic brain injury, and how common is that in a car accident?
So in its most basic sense, a traumatic brain injury, also known as a TBI, is a disruption of the normal function of the brain that's caused by some sort of external force. It could be a blow to the head, a jolt to the head. Most common culprits that we see are car crashes and falls. These are the big leading causes of TBIs, and it's just because they involve high-speed forces involved, sudden stops, and injuries to the brain.
So I've been in a car accident. I think I might have a TBI, right? So explain to me what the different types of TBIs are that might occur in a car accident, because there are varying degrees, right?
There are, sure. So TBIs can range from, mild concussions to very severe injuries like contusions, diffuse axonal injuries, and even hematomas. Each of these type affects the brain differently, and it can lead to various differing complications. For example, a concussion is often a temporary injury to a brain function, but severe injuries, like those axonal injuries, can cause widespread brain damage, leading to long-term impairments. And I'll just add that whichever part of your brain you injured will cause different symptoms and different neurological deficits. So if you injure the portion responsible for speech, you're going to have trouble finding words. If you injure the portion responsible for memory, you're going to experience changes to your long-term and short-term memory.
Yeah, so right. The brain is just it's a plethora of information flowing around up there, and you're right. Each part is responsible for a different piece. But that shearing, that axonal injury is such a beast. Where you come in, you're just cutting off the flow of information that's traveling between the body and the brain to the body, right? That can be pretty devastating. So let's talk about that then. Let's get into some of the complications. So you've had this injury, you've had some of that axonal, injury to that area. So what would we be looking at in terms of complications?
Right. So previously we talked about some of the other ones like seizures, epilepsy, hydrocephalus. But now I want to move on to some of the other ones. There's things that can be caused, things like infections. So that's one of the big categories. So things like meningitis, which can be an infection of the protective membranes covering the brain and spinal cord. Causes of this could result from a skull fracture or a penetrating brain injury that introduces bacteria into the brain that should not be there. Yeah. And the brain has a lot of trouble getting rid of stuff that shouldn't be in there, unfortunately. So a lot of time it involves very risky medical intervention. Symptoms of meningitis are severe headaches, stiff neck is a classic one, fever, sensitivity to light, and confusion. And the treatment of this, it really requires quick and prompt antibiotic treatment to prevent severe complications all the way up to death. It's a very serious condition. Another one would be a subdural empyema. So a collection of, pus between the dura mater and the arachnoid membrane, usually from an infection. This can cause a severe headache, fever, neurological deficits. This too usually requires surgical intervention, up to drainage and antibiotics. Another one would be a brain abscess. That's another thing. Basically, the brain has sustained some sort of injury, and there's swelling in the brain that can be caused by infection. We discussed swelling and why that's so dangerous last podcast, basically because the brain only has so much space to expand or move to. It can cause a very dangerous level of pressure in your head. The symptoms of a brain abscess would be headaches, fever, nausea, neurological symptoms like weakness or speech difficulties. And if you notice, Kylie, a lot of these symptoms are kind of similar and overlapping. So that's why it's so important. Can't stress it enough. If you've had a traumatic event and you know you've had involvement of your brain, it's just so important to get a specialist to review this stuff.
Absolutely.
Because we're not trying to make all the viewers hypochondriacs here, which is very possible to do with symptoms. But if you know you've had a serious head injury and you've been having these neurological deficits, it's just so great. And for peace of mind to get in with a neurologist who can do the proper diagnostics, do the proper treatment so that you can monitor this stuff and make sure you don't have a very serious situation like some of these things we're going over.
Yeah.
So with the brain abscess, it too requires surgical drainage and long-term antibiotic therapy.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of the things you're talking about there. Again, not to make our audience into a bunch of hypochondriacs, but sometimes fear is a great motivator, right? I have absolutely seen these types of infections, and there's the blood-brain barrier, so not all medications you give, like IV or in pill form, will get to the brain. So sometimes you have to give medicine directly into the brain through tubes that are inserted through the skull. They're in the hospital, obviously. You talked about that pressure that builds up. Sometimes it may come to what we call a craniotomy, where the surgeon would remove a part of the skull to allow the brain to swell outside the skull. And that patients can go home without that skull flap in place, and they will have to come back and have that skull flap put back on once that swelling is. So, we've talked in previous episodes about kind of a long haul with some of these injuries, and that's a long-term issue that you're gonna have to be dealing with. But it's pretty amazing what they're doing to treat some of these things. What else do we have? So talk about you've injured the brain. The brain controls everything, right? So our cognitive status at that point is obviously gonna be affected.
That's really, this next category is one of the big ones. And that's, like you mentioned, cognitive decline. So we've gone over some very specific, rare, very scary ones, but cognitive decline is the one that really impacts the majority of our clients long-term the most. This is the most common one. And there's short-term and long-term. With short-term cognitive problems, we'll see symptoms like confusion, difficulty remembering recent events, and even trouble concentrating. May not seem that, of a big deal on paper, the way I just read it, but you start thinking about trouble concentrating, you may go from a grade A top tier employee to someone that can hardly get the job done. You may not be able to focus on, organizing the house and your events and family stuff. It just huge impacts on people that we don't think about. Duration is typically, it can resolve, short-term cognitive problems can resolve within weeks to months, but unfortunately, a lot of times it leads to the next category, which is long-term cognitive decline, where that stuff does not get better. A lot of the studies show that if it exceeds that 6 to 8 month mark, it becomes pretty permanent in a lot of cases, which is a scary thing. Long-term cognitive decline, one area we see a lot would be very famous now in the news because of recent NFL reports, would be chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, a progressive condition resulting from repeated hits or injuries. Symptoms can include memory loss, confusion, depression, personality changes. A lot of renewed focus has been brought upon brain injury through these NFL reports. They're looking at NFL players after a long career and seeing just massive degradation of the brain. Unfortunately, for car crash victims, the forces are very similar to a helmet-to-helmet NFL hit. So we do unfortunately see people that after a severe bad brain injury and car crash, they present with similar symptoms as NFL players. In terms of the diagnosis, it's usually confirmed posthumously, so after death, through brain autopsy, showing that there's abnormal deposits in the brain. And if you've seen some of these pictures, the brain can literally look different than what you're used to seeing with the brain. I mean, it looks almost like it's broken down in certain areas.
Shrunken.
The impact. Cognitive problems can significantly affect daily functioning, work performance, even social interactions. We have a lot of clients that will say, when we're reaching out to family members or friends, they'll say this person was a social butterfly before the accident, and now they're more of a hermit, a shut-in. They don't come to the book club they used to do. They don't come to the softball games they used to be a teammate of. Instead, they stay home because they have headaches, sensitivity to light, or just depression, which occurs in a lot of people with brain injuries.
Yeah, you bring up a good point there at the end. I think, the marriage between what we know scientifically now and pro sports like football has been such a key force in moving this study of brain injuries forward. You mentioned there at the end of depression, suicidality, suicidal ideation is such a real thing with people that are dealing with CTE. You read so many stories about, ex-NFL athletes that deal with that sort of thing because of that CTE they're dealing with. Think about Muhammad Ali. Look at him, when he was in his prime versus later in his life. I mean, he's a completely different person. And that kind of leads me to thinking about other issues like movement disorders, because like with Ali, you saw it in him, the shuffling gait, just the way he moved, and not to mention his mentation. So talk about some of those movement disorders you might see.
Absolutely. Thanks for that lead in, Kiley. Movement disorders are a huge aspect of this. So types, we can see things like resting tremors, which occur when the body part is not in motion, or action tremors, where there may be some sort of occurring of the tremor during a voluntary movement. What does that look like? So it looks like shaking, rhythmic movements, often in the hands or the head, that shaking that you mentioned. Treatment would be medications. There are a list of them. We won't go into all that. Right. Very long name medications, but another thing is deep brain stimulation in severe cases. We're seeing this used more and more by some treating neurologists. Dystonia is another one. It's an involuntary muscle contraction causing repetitive movements or abnormal postures. And why is this such a bad thing? Well, it can affect the whole body or specific parts such as the neck or hands. And believe it or not, one of the treatments for this is Botox injections, which can have a paralyzing effect. So it can help that involuntary tremor not occur anymore through Botox. We see Botox, people think about it, it's the fountain of youth and the face shot, but really it has a lot of medical uses that we see. We see it done for headaches. We see it done like this for the tremors. So it has multiple applications. Another treatment that may help with this is physical therapy. Sometimes in severe cases, surgery. And getting onto this one, Parkinson's disease, which you mentioned, some of the symptoms of that could be slowness of movement, muscle stiffness, tremors, balance problems in very severe cases. Obviously, what links that to a traumatic brain injury? Well, that would be the repeated head trauma, which can increase the risk of developing Parkinson's disease.
Absolutely.
And that's something we try and advocate for our clients for when we're discussing case values and dealing with the insurance companies is, they sustain this initial injury, but you got to see long-term effects of this. It ups the average possibility lifetime for you developing Alzheimer's. It upticks that multiple percentage points if you've sustained serious concussions and brain injuries. Same with Parkinson's and other diseases. Medications to treat Parkinson's would include medications that increase dopamine levels, and there are some surgical options as well. Another category that is a big one would be fatigue and sleep disorders, with an emphasis on the impact of life stuff with the sleep disorder category. Anyone who has been sleep deprived can understand just how much of an impact that can have both on your sleeping life and your waking life. Fatigue, though, would be like a persistent feeling of tiredness that doesn't improve with rest, that can result in the brain's and impact the brain's recovery process, emotional stress, and physical deconditioning. One way to manage this would be to address the underlying medical conditions or physical therapy or, very dramatic lifestyle changes. And, when we're talking about sleep disorders, the big thing would be, that indicates that a brain injury victim has developed a sleep disorder would be difficulty falling or staying asleep, leading to daytime fatigue. This has a huge impact on our clients' lives because it can reduce your productivity, It can make you a more dangerous driver.
Yeah.
It can do just a whole host of things that have a detrimental impact on your quality of life. Another thing would be sleep apnea, so breathing interruptions during sleep causing poor sleep quality. Hypersomnia would be excessive sleepiness during the day, even after adequate nighttime sleep. Basically, the brain is having trouble getting those cues post-brain injury of when it should and shouldn't be in, sleeping, resting, awake mode. Those wires can get crossed.
Yeah.
How do we manage this? Well, treatments may include anything that improves sleep hygiene practices, CPAP machines, and medications for sleep disorders. Sometimes if you're in that category of brain injury, long-term complications where you can't get to sleep, you may take something ranging from a natural melatonin to something more serious like a prescribed medication drug. And there's also ones that will help you stay asleep as well. And we mentioned there about good sleep hygiene practices. That can include very basic things to more serious levels of intervention. So like basic good sleep hygiene practices could include having a routine before you go to bed. That means no screens as much as you want to do it before you go to bed. Kind of have a good period where you're getting away from screens before bedtime. We're finding more and more that can interrupt natural sleep cycles. So it's recommended to read a book, low light conditions. Another thing would be to potentially consider investing in blackout curtains. If your room gets a lot of light, it maintains the natural rhythmic orders of the body's sleep cycle. To have blackout curtains, and you get better sleep, they find too. This is good advice for anybody, but it's especially good if you have a sleep disorder stemming from a brain injury, because you really not only need to it's not just about the duration of your sleep, but it's the quality of the sleep as well. So if you already have something like a brain injury that's impacting your ability to get good sleep, you want to give yourself every best shot possible to get that good quality sleep. Yeah.
You may even have to do something like a sleep study where you're hooked up to, brainwave monitoring and they can see, are you achieving, REM cycle? You mentioned quality sleep. You can be asleep and not get good sleep. You're 100% right. So, man, you've covered a lot. The brain, it's our control center. It does everything. It's our motor, the way we interact with the world, the way we sense the world, sleeping, eating, our appetites, everything. You listed off some pretty significant potential injuries from a car crash, a TBI. So how does that impact a personal injury case? I can imagine that just opens a can of worms for you.
Yeah, so TBIs can significantly affect a personal injury case. Just due to the long-term medical costs, loss of income, and the serious impact on the victim's quality of life. So these factors often lead to much higher compensation claims, and it's really crucial, especially from our perspective, to fully document all the medical treatments and the symptoms with a fine-tooth comb, really. and we accomplish that by making sure the client and the victim is getting adequate care. It's crucial for the victim and the person who sustained this very life-altering injury to get to the right doctors. And if they can't themselves, because of the brain injury, communicate all the symptoms, or they don't know, to have someone there, like a friend or family member, advocate for them, to explain some of the differences so that the clinician can properly diagnose this stuff and document it. But yeah, these are some of the most important cases we handle. And that's just because the impact and then the after effects can literally be a lifetime.
Absolutely.
A lifetime. So it's very, very important that we document everything and get the best possible outcomes for our clients.
I think what I'd want to know next, is if I'm a victim of a car crash of any significant, force, whether I suspect I have a TBI or not, I feel like after hearing all this, I should dig into that with my physician, make sure I'm answering the questions, digging into letting them ask all the appropriate things to see if there might be some TBI to deal with. What should I do if I'm in that position? How do I go about doing that after a car crash?
Yeah, so definitely and we've said this numerous times in the past on this podcast, if you feel as though you've sustained a head injury, especially after something as traumatic as a brain injury or a very serious fall, go get checked out by a medical professional. Don't roll the dice on this, especially on this one thing, just because it could be the difference between life or death, or a serious long-term damage you're potentially causing yourself. If you have a concussion or experiencing some of these neurological deficits and symptoms, this is not the time when you want to try and tough it out, or wait and see. Sometimes waiting and seeing can be the difference between life and death. Unfortunately, if you have a brain bleed or expanding pressure in the brain after a bad airbag hit, you don't want to wait on this. Please go get checked out by the correct clinician, ER typically. Get everything documented. Worst case scenario, just, if you don't have a terrible injury, at least you got checked out just to be sure. And then the next thing you would want to do is on something this serious, if you are going to reach out and seek legal counsel, definitely consider reaching out to an attorney just to at least review the case, because there's so many things at play here. And we've talked on previous podcasts where it's a lot to juggle when you have a brain injury. Your brain is damaged, it's in the healing process, and then you also have to try and juggle the legal aspect of it. Sometimes it's beneficial in a case like this to reach out and seek help with legal counsel.
100%. Yeah. You don't know what you don't know. So I would definitely want a professional on my side, making sure that they're guiding me through this extremely complicated process. Okay, everybody, that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you have enjoyed it and it's found it as fascinating as I have. John, thank you once again for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. Please hit like and subscribe and hit that bell for notifications for all our latest and greatest content. And as always, if you're in pain, call Shane at 980-999-9999.
In pain, so I call Shane. 980-999-9999. In pain, call Shane.